3 months ago, Russia launched its war on Ukraine, and we all thought it might be over in a few days. US intel predicted Kyiv would fall quickly to Russian paratroopers and tank columns. But that didn't happen, thankfully. Not only have the Ukrainians defended themselves over the last few months with the help of the Western world, but they've gone on the offensive. Ukrainian troops this week retook land around the major city of Kharkiv, ruining Russian plans for a blitzkrieg offensive. In fact, Ukraine's defense ministry put out a video suggesting its troops have made it to the Russian border, pushing Russian invaders back onto their own turf. NBC News has not confirmed where or when that video was shot. But according to the UK Defense Ministry today, Russia has sacked 2 generals, one of whom was responsible for Kharkiv. Meanwhile, the pipeline of NATO military materiel to Ukraine remains open, and more European nations are seeking to join the alliance itself, most recently Finland and Sweden. Even Russians are breaking through the Kremlin's propaganda wall to say their situation in Ukraine is dire. Here's a retired Russian colonel, making the anchors of a show on state TV very uncomfortable with a very sober take on this war.
Самое главное недостаток нашего военно-политического положения в том, что мы в полном геополитическом одиночестве. И практически против нас, как бы нам это не хотелось признавать, весь мир. И вот из этой ситуации надо выходить.
So these are all growing signs that Ukraine is not just surviving the Russian military onslaught, it's actually starting to win the war. But there's now a new question some in European capitals are asking. What if Ukraine winning the war isn't actually a good thing? Bear with me here. Let me explain. Politico reports that after weeks spent fretting over what would happen if Russia crushed Ukraine, Western European leaders are now worried about what might happen if Ukraine actually wins. Politico adds that after meeting with Joe Biden last week, the Italian Prime Minister pushed for a Ukrainian peace deal, now adding to calls from Germany and France for negotiations. The fear, as French President Emmanuel Macron put it last week, is that prolonging the war and the Ukrainian advances further humiliates Russian President Vladimir Putin, inviting further escalation from Moscow. The fear of Putin's so-called tactical nuclear weapons is not idle speculation. The use of those WMDs for quote-unquote defense is part of Russian military doctrine. As a Kremlin spokesman told Christian Amanpour in March,
I need to ask you this because the world is afraid, and I want to know whether Putin intends the world to be afraid of the nuclear option. Would he use it?
We have a concept of domestic security. And, it's public. You can read all the reasons for nuclear arms to be used. So if it is an existential threat for our country, then it can be used in accordance with our concept.
Not terribly comforting when we're in an unprecedented war and Vladimir Putin is facing an unprecedented problem as he continues to try to cover up to his people the real costs of the war, and when he tries to blame it all not just on Ukraine but on NATO. It's not just world leaders recommending an off-ramp now, as Dartmouth professor and nuclear proliferation expert Nicholas Miller put it on Twitter recently. Quote, I understand emotionally why people are rooting for a humiliating, decisive defeat of the Russian military, but let's not ignore the fact that the prospect of such a defeat is one of the most plausible scenarios for nuclear use. But so far, that's not the American government's view.
We want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine. So it has already lost a lot of military capability and a lot of its troops, quite frankly. And we want to see them not have the capability to very quickly reproduce that capability.
Ukraine can win, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin added in those comments from last month. And he was echoed this week by none other than Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who followed up his own visit to Ukraine by telling NPR, quote, we're all on the same team on this. The Russians need to lose. The Ukrainians need to win. In fact, in a bipartisan vote Thursday, the Senate passed a bill for $40 billion in new aid to Ukraine. But in all of this, let's not forget that the ultimate decision on how and when the war ends belongs to the Ukrainian people and to the Ukrainian government. No one ought to question that. But of course, if Russia escalates with nuclear weapons, that affects all of us. So it's worth asking those who favor a ceasefire or an off-ramp for Putin, how do you get to a settlement that doesn't erode Ukraine's sovereignty, that doesn't carve up its territory, and that also doesn't humiliate Putin? And it's also worth asking the total victory camp, how long and how many more lives will that take? And what can be done along the way to prevent Putin from making an even bigger, deadlier gamble? Much to discuss and debate. Joining me now are Ivo Dolder, the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and former U.S. ambassador to NATO, and Anatol Lieven, senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute and author of Ukraine and Russia, A Fraternal Rivalry. Thank you both for coming back on the show and coming back together. Anatol, let me start with you. You and I have discussed Russia's war in Ukraine multiple times on this show. And early on, you pushed for a diplomatic deal on the grounds that Ukraine could not win. But they are winning right now. And some people, I assume you two, are pushing again for a diplomatic deal to prevent further escalation by Russia. If Russia is winning, do a deal. If Russia is losing, do a deal. It feels like for Moscow, it's kind of heads I win, tails you lose.
Well, it depends what you mean by Ukraine winning. The point is that Ukraine has already won a great victory, which is Putin had the intention of getting rid of the Ukrainian government, clearly capturing Kiev and reducing Ukraine as a whole to a client state. Now that's over. Now, we shouldn't underestimate what a colossal thing that is in historic terms as a success for Ukraine and as a defeat for Russia, because it means that even if Russia keeps some bits of Ukrainian territory, the vast majority of Ukraine will now move towards the West. And the speed of that move towards the European Union, as of course European leaders have emphasized, will depend on Ukraine's own capacity for reform and of course Western aid as well. So I mean, that is already a tremendous success. What we're talking about now is essentially the terms of a territorial deal in eastern and southern Ukraine. And a key question there is, previously, Ukraine was saying basically we push, Russia has to abandon, absolutely rightly, all the territory it has taken since it invaded in February. That is something that we should all support. Yeah. But now you have voices saying that Russia must that Ukraine should go on to try to conquer the separatist regions of the Donbass and even recapture Crimea, which Russia, according to Russia, of course, nobody else, annexed in 2014. Now, at that point...
Well, okay, let's bring in Ivo. Let's bring in Ivo. It's a good point you make, although... Go on. Okay, finish your point, Anatol, briefly.
Yeah, briefly. But at that point, since the Russians say this is Russian territory, the issue of Russia using nuclear weapons has been raised as a possibility.
And those are all fair points. I want to have Ivo respond. Just to be clear, the Ukrainians, I wouldn't use the word conquer. You can't conquer if it's your own territory. But I know the point you were making, retake. Ivo, you've tweeted that a Russian ceasefire cements Russia's current positions in place. Difficult to see how Ukraine accepts that or why this is an outcome that we should support. But you also recognize the risks of an escalation. You came on this show before and were skeptical about a no-fly zone for precisely that reason. Shouldn't we be more sober about the risks of continued Russian losses? I, for one, would love nothing more than to give a humiliating defeat to Vladimir Putin. But at the same time, I don't ignore the fact that he has nuclear weapons.
No, and we shouldn't ignore that he has nuclear weapons, and we shouldn't let that single fact be the only thing that matters in this situation. Let's just step back for a second. Vladimir Putin is the one who put himself in this position. He's the one who decided that Russia needed to invade. And the responses that we've seen since are all negative for Russia. They are negative in terms of the economy, given the sanctions. They're negative in terms of where NATO is, which is now militarily boosting its own presence in Eastern Europe. And as of yesterday, likely to see two more members, Finland and Sweden, joining the alliance. And Russia, as Anatol rightly said, has not achieved its even at the beginning of its goals in Ukraine. And so if Russia wants an off-ramp at this point, the way to do that is to turn the forces around and go home. Nobody asked them to come in here. Nobody asked them to be part in Ukraine, and they ought to be able to do that. If the Ukrainians at the moment are feeling that they have the capacity to, at the very least, push them back to where we were on February 23rd, and I think that would be a major step in the right direction, and then perhaps have a negotiation about where we're going to be, I think that makes sense. I agree with Anatol that if you get into a military confrontation in Crimea, you may raise the stakes a little further than they need to be raised. But even the status of Crimea ought to be part of any negotiation that the two parties have. And who is going to negotiate and when they're going to go negotiate really isn't up to the president of France or the chancellor of Germany or the prime minister of Italy. It's up to the Ukrainians and the Russians, and let's support them in that effort.
So, Anatol, Eva makes a very good point that the easiest off-ramp is for the Russians just to turn around and go home. I also want to put this point to you. Yale historian Tim Snyder says that Putin's hold on the media narrative in Russia makes any potential off-ramps kind of useless. He tweets, quote, "Talking of off-ramps just gives Russian leaders something to laugh about in what are otherwise difficult times. Putin's power over media will be complete until the moment when it ceases. There is no interval where our actions in the real world will make a difference. Either our off-ramps are unnecessary or they are irrelevant." What's your response to Tim Snyder?
Well, I think that completely underestimates the power of social discontent in Russia. I mean, if you remember, when Gorbachev came to power, when the whole Soviet apparatus was still in place, in 1985, he found a mailbag full of complaining, protesting letters from mothers, from wives about the war in Afghanistan. Russian casualties, as they mount, will have an effect on Russian public opinion, irrespective of what people know when their relatives have been killed. So, there will be pressures on Putin, notwithstanding. But I agree with the great majority of what Ivo has said. The only thing is, of course, that don't forget that for the Ukrainians to go fully onto the offensive, not just local offensives, but fully onto the offensive, will create a different military equation. That there is the risk that they will turn victory into defeat. And the second thing is, once again, Ivo said, the Russians go back to the line of February the 23rd, and then we negotiate. But if we can, if enough pressure is put on Russia, and Russia's failure to achieve its objectives, that there is the possibility that they will do that as part of a diplomatic settlement, we shouldn't exclude that in the hope of a complete Ukrainian victory.
Eva, what about the evolution of U.S. war goals? We've obviously supplied weapons and aid from the beginning, but have a listen to what Massachusetts Democratic Congressman Seth Moulton told Fox a couple of weeks ago.
But at the end of the day, we've got to realize we're at war. And we're not just at war to support the Ukrainians. We're fundamentally at war, although it's somewhat through a proxy, with Russia, and it's important that we win.
Do you agree with that analysis, that we are at war with Russia? It's basically a proxy war now?
No, I don't think it's particularly helpful to put it in those terms. Russia's at war with Ukraine. It's a war that Ukraine didn't ask for, it didn't want. We are helping the Ukrainians to defend themselves. I've always thought and argued that this is not a war we want to fight directly. That would fundamentally change the nature of the conflict in a way that I don't think is helpful for anyone. What we need to do is to support the Ukrainians, and to do that not only militarily but also diplomatically. It means that it is up to Ukraine to decide at what point they want to have a negotiation, and then it's up for the Ukraine to decide what they're willing to live with regard to the capabilities that the Russians still have. But we're not at war with Russia. Russia is an enemy. It's an adversary. We have a real fundamental difference with them, not just in Ukraine, but in a lot of other places. And we will do what we need to do in order to deter and, if necessary, to confront Russia if and when our interests are affected. But for now, this is a war that is taking place between Ukraine and Russia. And our support for Ukraine is exactly the right thing to do, given the fact that it's Russia that started this war, and it's Russia that can end this war tomorrow.
And Russia started the war by illegally invading Ukraine. On that note, one last question to you, Anatol, before we run out of time. Yesterday, we heard somewhat of a Freudian slip from former President George W. Bush. Have a listen.
In contrast, Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, anyway. 75.
Anatol, putting aside the laughter, which is pretty disgusting when hundreds of thousands of people died in that illegal invasion, is it not another reminder that it would be much better for the United States to hold other countries to account for illegal invasions if we didn't do them too, and if we held our people to account when they did them?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, and that is why outside the Western alliance, you have countries, including countries, which are in principle very friendly to America, like India, who have not sided with America in imposing sanctions because they do see this strong element of double standards, and what they would like would be, a system based on international law rather than what's called a rules-based order in which the West makes the rules. Could I just add one more thing? Briefly. When it comes to making peace in Ukraine, of course, the Ukrainians have to play the principal role. But look, if we are giving massive aid, but if we're also running immense economic risks for ourselves, the world economy, the global starvation, as the Secretary General of the UN said yesterday, then obviously that also gives us a moral right to a say in making a peace settlement. It's not only up to the Ukrainians and Russians.
Eva, I want to give you the last word, 30 seconds, to either respond to Anatol or respond to that George Bush clip.
Yeah, it was an unfortunate clip. As he said, he's 75, so maybe we all slip the tongue once in a while. I mean, the bigger point, of course, is that he is right that Putin doesn't have any checks and balances. He can do whatever he wants to do. He decided to launch a massively destructive war, massively destructive for the people of Ukraine, but ultimately massively destructive for the people of Russia. This is a price that is going to be paid for many, many years, and it's deeply unfortunate that we're in this situation in the 21st century.